So today our speaker is Madison Barben, and so she's a senior history major and she's minoring in museum studies. And her talk today is cross versus cross. And so everyone welcome.
Today I'm talking about the Kirchenkampf and the Holocaust, which I'll define that large German word in a moment. This is a little brief thing, so I'm looking at like the German churches and their relationship with the Nazi Party and just what kind of went with the relationship with those two. So the Martin Luther Memorial Church in Mariendorf, Berlin looks like any 20th century church. You know, it has like a steeple with a cross, high ceilings, and an ornate organ. Nothing about it looks really that distinct. However, if you take a closer look, what you find might surprise you. So inside we have the pulpit has Christ with a Nazi Wehrmacht soldier. The baptismal font is adorned by a Nazi SS soldier along with women, children, and Christ as well. And then some of the panels that create that arch used to include swastikas. So the Martin Luther Memorial Church was built in October 1933 during the Nazi rise to power. So the church is really symbolic of that complex relationship between the church and the state during the early 1930s. So as part of like a Nazi policy, there is a policy of Gleichschaltung, which was kind of the assimilation of all aspects of life under the Nazi Party. So along with that idea, religion was also viewed as another way how the Nazi Party could become even more in control of everyday life. So with that, with the church wanting to become more, the state wanting to become more involved, obviously some of the churches would have to decide, will they align with the Nazi Party or oppose it, which brought up many complications. And so there was violence and resistance. So the Kirchenkampf is quite literally translated as church struggle. And the Kirchenkampf is basically the struggle between the German Protestant churches, I'm focusing mainly on the Protestant churches for this talk, and the Nazi Party. But it's also an internal struggle between the German churches because you had some groups that opposed the Nazi Party and other groups that wanted to join them and follow their ideas. So one of the big controversies within the Kirchenkampf is also the Jewish question. What do we do with the Jews of Germany? Are we going to persecute? Do they persecute them? Do they help them? What do they do with the Jews? So in my presentation today, I want to really talk to you about that church struggle, the struggle of the German churches as a whole with the Nazi state, but then also the internal struggle between the churches, and then whether they, and ultimately, like, were they able to have a response to the Jewish question? And in all, I believe that they failed to provide that unified response against the persecution of Jews because of the Kirchenkampf and struggle between all the churches. So the Kirchenkampf can be broken down into 5 stages. So we have from spring 1932 until fall of 1933, which is that like idea of Gleichschaltung, and it's really when the pro and anti-Nazi religious groups are first formed. In the fall of 1933 until 1934, it was the full kind of assimilation of the church under Nazi ideology, and then you have the even more increased 2 church extremes. And then 1934 to 1937, you see some restriction against the opposing churches that went against the Nazi Party. 1937 to 1939, there is even more increased restriction toward resistance. So between these 2 times, we have like the opposing churches becoming even more like resistant toward the Nazi Party, and in return, the party is becoming restricting them even more. And then finally, we have 1939 through 1945, with the other resisting churches and theologians becoming imprisoned, and it's just absolutely escalating throughout. So throughout the timeline, it's just the conflict conflict just escalates with even more tensions. So Hitler himself was kind of indifferent towards religion. It was not religious himself. However, he saw the importance that the church had with some German people. So for example, not everyone was religious in Germany, but when it comes with like Protestants and Catholics, the Protestant church was the largest denomination, and then specifically the German Evangelical Church was the largest denomination in Germany. And so he saw that even though he didn't agree with religion and didn't believe it, other people did. And so he had this idea to create a single centralized National Socialist right church that he would have some say in controlling because he'd be able to appoint who was the head of it. Which, for the Protestant church, is quite a feat. Because if you do not know, the Protestant church, unlike the Catholic church, has no head person. Like it's made up of a bunch of denominations with all different people, kind of different pastors. There's no centralized figure like in the Catholic church having a centralized pope. So creating that Reichschurch with one person in the center was a big deal, but also, because of how fragmented churches already were, pretty hard to do and very difficult. And we'll talk more about those difficulties. So Nazi ideology kind of viewed Hitler as a prophet already, and then with religion, I'll see in a little bit, they viewed him also in that same way. So Hitler's dream of kind of having a centralized Reichschurch really happened and started in 1932 when a group of theologians, politicians, and lay people met together to talk about how they're going to align the Protestant church with the Nazi Party. So they met together in the group that met later became the Deutsche Christen or German Christians. So the German Christians, one of their first things that they wrote, said that they focus on achieving an integration of the 29 constituent churches of the German Evangelical Association into one national Protestant church. And so in this sense, corroborating Hitler's idea of having a single main church. So at their first National Assembly in Berlin, a Nazi official and politician, Wilhelm Kube, who was also a strong German Christian, was quoted saying, "The church is for a German, a communion of believers that is duty-bound to the battle for its Christian Germany. The goal of the German Christian faith movement is one evangelical German church. The state of Adolf Hitler calls for such a church. The church must hear that call." So I think from this quote you can really get the idea of what the German Christians, what their goal was. They really wanted to just focus on having the church, no matter what, aligning with the Nazi Party, and really viewed Hitler as a prophet, as that what they called pure Messiah or pure Jesus. So they really just saw him as being like this like glorified person now in the church who's just come back to save Germans. And one interesting thing is with the churches, bringing these like Nazi ideology into their doctrine was not coerced. They decided to do it on their own accord. And even within the church themselves, they called each other the stormtroopers of Christ. So stormtroopers kind of, I think that's what like the SS soldiers were also called in Germany. So kind of aligned themselves with being Nazi soldiers for religion. So, also coming out of the German Christian movement, one of the big things that really happened to kind of bring them more power was the election of a Reichsbishop. And I think I went past my slide too early, but they elected Ludwig Müller, who was a military chaplain for the Nazi Party and also an associate of Hitler. So he was elected as a Reichsbishop to kind of be the head of their Nazi-oriented Christian church and religion. So there's a picture of Hitler and Ludwig Müller right here, and you can see it also over there. I don't want to run all the way over. I guess I could. But really, so all these different things mixing together was really showing that the German Christians were kind of increasing in their power in religion and also with the Nazi Party. So So one legislation that really started to kind of bring questions and started the controversy of the Jewish question was the restoration of the professional civil service in 1933. So as a part of this, it had the Aryan paragraph, which stated civil servants of non-Aryan descent are to be retired, honorary officials are to be removed from official status. So this caused different pastors who would have Aryan blood, or like were once Jewish or had Jewish relatives, to then not be able to hold those offices. And so the German Christians decided to also add the Aryan paragraph to their church doctrine. So I have their paragraph up here on the board for you guys to read, and I'm also going to say it to you as well. So those of non-Aryan or married to someone of non-Aryan descent may not be called as clergy or officials in general church administration. Correspondingly, shall apply also to members of the church bodies as well as those in volunteer church positions. So the German Christians' Aryan paragraph was the first time that the German Christians denied non-Aryans, specifically Jews, from holding offices and being in congregations. So I've talked a lot already. I'm going to take a quick break. So I've talked a lot already about the German Christians and the group that assimilated with the Nazi Party, but not everyone agreed with it. So I'm going to focus on three individuals right now who really were going against what the German Christians were doing and the Nazi Party as a whole. So first we have Karl Barth, who is on the far right. And so he rejected the Aryan paragraph and wrote about his rejection towards it, and how he thought that it should be kind of written for Jewish Christians. So in one of his essays that he wrote, he said, the community of those who belong to the church is not determined by blood, so also not by race, but rather by the Holy Spirit and baptism. If the German Protestant Church were to exclude Jewish Christians or treat them as second-class Christians, it would have ceased to be a Christian church. So one of the interesting things about what Karl Barth is saying, so he is talking about Jews, but not specifically ordinary German Jews. He specified Jewish Christians, so Jewish Christians were Christians who converted from Judaism. They may have also been Messianic Jews. I'm not exactly sure. I couldn't find it exactly in my research. But either way, they converted to Christianity or had believed in Christianity. So according to theologians like Barth, Jewish Christians were distinguished separately from Jews because they were baptized into the church. And under the church doctrine, they were protected and as Christians due to their baptism. So another theologian that also spoke out against the Aryan paragraph was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So in his essay, The Church and the Jewish Question, he called out the actions of the Protestant Church against the legal discrimination of Jews. However, in that as well, he only referred to Jewish Christians and not to all Jews. So the consolidation of the German Christians, the Aryan paragraph, and then the election of a Reich bishop caused a lot of theologians who opposed it to kind of create a group effort against the Nazi Party. So then we have the creation of the Pastors Emergency League by Martin Niemöller, who is on the left, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer also helped to create it. So the Pastors Emergency League was a resistance group wanting to help and aid those Jewish Christians who, because of the Aryan paragraph, were not able to hold church offices anymore or be in congregations. The Pastors Emergency League then led into a larger formation of an opposition church called the Confessing Church, which was Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a member of it, and Karl Barth and Martin Niemöller were as well. So the three men that I showed earlier. So it was founded in 1930. So it was founded in around 1934 with the Barben Declaration. And so the Barben Declaration the focus was to define the clear boundaries between the Protestant Church and the Nazi Party, and defining what lines the Nazi Party should not be allowed to cross. So one statement from the Barben Declaration is, we reject the false doctrine as though the state, over and beyond its special commission, should and could become the single and totalitarian order of human life, thus fulfilling the church's vocation as well. So in his quote, he's denying the Nazi Party having a control of religion and of life because, in his mind, it's the job of the church to bring that moral and order into everyday life, not the Nazi Party. So in the Barben Declaration, they were really telling the Nazi Party that we're stepping on our toes, going into our business, and this is the boundaries that we want to have. One issue with the Barben Declaration is that it does not say really that much about the Jewish population or answer that Jewish question. So it doesn't refer to Jewish Christians or just Jews in general or anything with that. So, for example, not everyone agreed with the Barben Declaration not taking a stance on the Jews. For example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer believed that the church should use the Barben Declaration as an official stance against the persecution of Jewish Christians and hopefully all Jews. However, while some agreed with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, many other people did not. So some supplemented not wanting to go with the Barben Declaration or the persecution of Jews because they wanted to focus more on the pastors that were being persecuted themselves and being taken to various concentration camps, and then just other legal reasons. So the Jewish question and just views of Jews and their persecution was kind of put as a side thing that wasn't going to be part of the confessing church, wasn't going to be one of their main ideas. So kind of the turning point for the Kirchenkampf was Kristallnacht, which happened on November 9th through 10th, 1938. So the night of the broken glass, Jewish businesses were destroyed all over Germany, and just people were taken out, and it was just so much destruction. So because of that, a lot of members of the confessing church saw this and how in this pogrom and really saw that the Jews are being persecuted, and some were thinking that it could lead to more oppression. However, not everyone agreed with that. There are members of the confessing church that do not think that it could get worse or anything happen. So we had some groups that were starting to really bring more opposition and really have more verbal resistance against the Nazi Party and against the German Christians. But many confessing church members also did not. So Kristallnacht also was kind of a turning point for the German Christians as well. And they had a reaction that was more of a verbal stance against Jews and for the persecution of Jews. So in the Godesberg Declaration, which was written in 1939 by Siegfried Riefler, he stated, with all the strength of our faith and our active life, we serve the man who has led our people out of servitude and misery to freedom and true greatness. And that again, he's talking about Adolf Hitler as that Messiah, that pure Jesus. And so kind of viewing him as even more a prophet that they should follow. Also in the Godesberg Declaration was the creation of the Institute for the Study and Eradication of Jewish Influence in Church and German Life. So according to historian Doris Bergen, she views this, what was made to be as kind of like an ecclesiastical final solution, because it focused on the eradication of not really eradication of Jews, but eradication of them from being in church life and being able to go to churches and congregations. So kind of like the Judaizing of the German church. So the Nazi state began deporting Jews and other non-Aryans in the autumn of 1941. And so these deportations was what really got the confessing church to start going to like more hands-on action. We had people that started gathering supplies and different articles so that people could go, so Jews could go undercover, giving them safety in their homes. And then also there were some smuggling attempts. For example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hands-on in a smuggling attempt called Operation 7, in which they smuggled 14 Jews with false papers to Switzerland. And as a result of this smuggling operation, he was arrested by the Gestapo and held in prison. If I remember correctly, I believe he died in prison as well. Which the prison is still there in Berlin if you're interested. It's now a museum, but it's really interesting, and they talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer briefly there. So you have like people who are actively doing something hands-on to help the Jewish population as a result of the deportations. But again, as in John Ocht and even with the Nuremberg laws, many people in the confessing church still did not view the Jews to be the main problem. They viewed that it was the Nazi Party taking in and trying to take over some church offices and take more control to be the main issue. So even though Dietrich Bonhoeffer and many other theologians were actively wanting to help the Jews, many people did not realize that it was a priority. So the Kirchenkampf ended with the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945. So during the Allied denazification of Germany, the Western Allies put the confessing church and neutral churches in control of the German Protestant church as a whole. And so there was a debate to decide what to do with the German Christians that were like assimilated to the Nazi Party. Would they be allowed to keep on preaching, or what was going to happen to them? They went through this whole idea of de-German Christianizing and taking out pastors who had been part of the movement and not allowing them to preach. And in 1947, the central office of the Protestant Church in Germany announced that the German Christian threat was eliminated. However, although they said the religious group officially said that it was over, it really wasn't, and there were still pastors that were preaching that were once German Christians. So while they noticed some people that would have had involvement, some people were still preaching, and even though they had this backstory behind them. And after the war, previous German Christians, some of them kept their involvement. There was one pastor who kept on talking about the persecution after the war towards the German Christians for what they did and said during the Third Reich. But then there are also other pastors that denied having any involvement in the German Christian movement whatsoever. So after the Protestant churches ceased their fight with the Nazi Party, they were forced to come to terms with what happened during the Third Reich, during the post-war period. So during the post-war period and after the Nuremberg trials, many members of the confessing church alleged that they did not fully understand the gravity of Jewish persecution during the Holocaust, and then tried to state why they didn't fully realize it before, and then tried to justify their stance after. So the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt was written in 1945 by the German Evangelical Church and was the first written Protestant response toward the Holocaust. And it said, "We accuse ourselves for not standing to our beliefs more courageously, for not praying more faithfully, for not believing more joyously, and for not loving more ardently." So in this declaration, they clearly admitted their guilt. However, they had no response towards the Holocaust and what happened with the persecution of Jews. So in 1967, Karl Barth, who was a theologian that I talked about earlier and wrote the Barben Declaration, wrote a letter to his friend Eberhard, I cannot pronounce this guy's last name, who was a student, close friend, and a biographer of Bonhoeffer. And in this letter, Karl Barth really revealed some of like the feelings that he had felt being a member of the confessing church and not fully realizing the issues and the persecution of Jews in Germany, and that it was a major issue. So Karl Barth wrote, even among the churchmen who saw the spiritual treason and murderous direction of Nazi totalitarianism most clearly, there was little enough awareness that the heart of the matter was the Jewish question. So I think in Karl Barth's response really just shows that people didn't fully realize what was going on, but yet they also did. There was quotes that were written about how people in the confessing church clearly knew that there were some deportations or something happening with people, but yet it was too late when they discovered what was really happening and how much an issue the persecution of Jews was. So the German Protestant Church failed to provide a unified response against the persecution of Jews during the Holocaust. And this Kirchenkampf, church struggle between the Nazi Party as a whole and the churches as a whole, was one of the things that caused it, but then also those internal struggle between the churches. So it's really a result of not being able to go against the Nazi Party and fully realize the problems of the Jewish persecution. For example, we have the German Christians decide to assimilate with the Nazi Party and follow their ideas. But then there's also the confessing church, which went against the Nazi Party, but however, the confessing church supported the Nazi Party at times until it was really going against church policies or taking power away from religion of the church. So in the end, the persecution of Jews, so it was really the failure of the German Protestant Church to stand against persecution of the Jews was falling on the shoulders of the confessing church and their inability to realize how the gravity of the persecution. So after the war and the discovery of the extremity of the Holocaust, both groups were forced to come to terms with their actions during the Third Reich. The German Christians coming to deal with the fact that they'd have to either hide and deny for the rest of their life of their involvement. And then the confessing church, those having to realize and justify why they did not help right away. And due to the tensions between members of the confessing church and the German Christians, the German Protestant church as a whole was not able to assist in saving 6 million Jews from persecution and elimination.